Despite Lukashenko's lack of imagination and decades of oppressing his people, we must not forget that Belarus is an independent country whose sovereignty is under attack. Another target of Russian malign influence.
Belarus matters a lot, and it soon may matter even more. The position and behavior of Alyaksandr Lukashenko's authoritarian regime, as distasteful as we may find that regime, is a key factor in the security balance on NATO's eastern flank. It could also become the linchpin in any kinetic conflict between Russia and the West. Vladimir Putin, of course, would like to turn Belarus into a de facto extension of Russia's western military districts, which would enhance Moscow's ability to seal off the Suwałki Corridor, cut off the Baltic states from NATO, and threaten allies like Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The Lukashenko regime is resisting for now. So what happens next? Hello from SIPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Michael Carpenter, director of the Penn Biden Center. Welcome back to the podcast, Mike.
Thanks, Brian.
And also with us in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome back, Don.
Hi, Brian. Hi, Mike. Good to be back.
Good to have you. So Belarus has been very much on the agenda in recent weeks here in Washington. I testified last month at the U.S. Helsinki Commission hearings at the U.S. Congress on Russian malign influence in Belarus. Don, you just co-authored an excellent SIPA report on Belarus. Mike, I know you got something in the pipeline on Belarus coming out soon, and you were recently quoted in an interview as saying that it was Russia's aggression in Ukraine that led to a change in U.S. policy toward Belarus and the normalization of relations. There's good reason for all this attention. Vladimir Putin and Alyaksandr Lukashenko are due to meet this weekend to discuss a revised integration plan that would unite Russia's and Belarus's tax, customs, and civil codes by 2021. It also calls for further steps to harmonize industrial policy and regulation of the gas and electricity markets. And down the road, it seems to establish common regimes for banking, foreign exchange control, and sanctions policy. Now, given that Russia's economy is 29 times the size of Belarus, the agreement would result in the de facto absorption of the country. Moscow is also pressuring Belarus into accepting a new Russian airbase on its territory, integrating the defense and security apparatus of Belarus and Russia's armed forces into a joint decision-making center in Moscow, a model that's already been implemented in Georgia's occupied regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So there's a lot on the plate between Russia and Belarus. Mike, you recently traveled to Minsk and met with Lukashenko, and for the time being, he seems to be resisting.
I'm not sure he can resist that much longer.
This is where I wanted to go with this.
That's where the meeting in Sochi this weekend, why it's so important, because Putin is putting the screws on Lukashenko, and I'm not sure how much longer he can resist. This soft integration project is essentially incorporating Belarus into Russia's regulatory regime.
Basically.
And so, this is Putin's preferred method. He doesn't want to have to use military force in the hard scenario that is also out there. But I don't know how much longer Lukashenko can resist these overtures.
So what are we looking at? Are we looking at a soft annexation here? And what does that mean for Western policy?
I think so. I think we're looking at the gradual absorption of Belarus through this regulatory harmonization. It is essentially Putin is trying to mimic what the EU is doing with all of the various association agreements that it has with states in Eastern Europe, only integrating Belarus into Russia the other way. So it's a preemptive move to prevent any future regime in Minsk from getting closer to Europe. And it looks like he's going to succeed. There's still a number of disputed points. Last I heard, it was either 10 or 16, depending on who you talk to. But at the end of the day, I don't see how much longer Lukashenko can sort of resist this move that is clearly afoot.
So you don't see, and what does Western policy do in that situation?
Well, I think we have to continue to try to support Belarusian sovereignty by using soft power methods, by supporting the language, the culture, ties, especially between Europe and Belarus. In this regard, I think visa policy is tremendously important. it would be great if there were more Western investments in Belarus, but of course that requires that Belarus open up and adopt intellectual property rights and the sort of business climate that we demand for Western investors. And it's not clear that Lukashenko is going to do that. He rejected the IMF's program that they were putting forward for Belarus precisely because it had too much conditionality attached to it. So it looks like he's right now moving closer to Moscow. He's always been in Russia's orbit, but moving closer in the eastern direction rather than the western direction.
Now, Don, you recently, in your recently co-authored report here at SIPA, you effectively argue that Lukashenko's overtures to the West are not very sincere. They're effectively posturing to extract concessions from Russia. Now, I used to think that, but I think something's changed. I think Lukashenko has gotten more desperate because I think he sees the writing on the wall, and that this kind of relationship, this transactional relationship he's been able to maintain with Moscow up until now is past its sell-by date. And so I think his overtures have become more sincere over time
because he's desperate.
Because he's desperate for no other. I'm not saying he's a great guy, but because he's desperate. But I mean, do you think he's concerned at all about losing Belarusian sovereignty to Russia and by extension his power? Because that's the end of his power if he loses.
Well, yes. First of all, I want to say what we wrote in the report, I don't think is at variance with what Mike said and you said both so eloquently. I think he's trying to maintain his power base in what's an uphill battle increasingly, and some of the stuff he appears to do, some, but by no means all, is an attempt to offset, if possible, and it may not be possible, these tentacles from Moscow that are dragging him in more closely. What I don't like or agree with is the tendency of some people in Washington to think that somehow this is 1989 again and we're going to somehow see some kind of democratic transformation in
that's
Belarus,
fantasy.
Which is absolutely not the case. So I think on the policy side of it, we have to be more realistic and sober about this and not see some of the kinds of optimistic scenarios we've seen portrayed. But Brian, you made an excellent point, you did too, Mike, about this issue of informal gathering of lands. I think some people maybe expect a military invasion or something, and this is not going to happen. The Russians want the sanctions to end. They know and they've tried elsewhere, as you said, they've tried this kind of creeping stuff in Georgia and elsewhere and Ukraine. And I think that's what they're trying here, knowing that if the frog's boiled, to use the old cliche, if the frog's broiled over a half hour, he's still boiled.
Well, I think there's an escalation ladder. I don't rule out a military option here. I think the bottom of the escalation ladder is this pressuring Lukashenko into this soft integration, which would result in a soft annexation. If that fails, you got the regime change card, basically. Belarus has elections next year, and Moscow could play that card effectively and effectively remove him. I mean, what I fear is the fake Maidan in Belarus, where you have he fixes the election like he always does. You get you get street demonstrations, but they're sponsored by Moscow, basically, and you get the fake Maidan.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that the Kremlin is really too worried about the presidential election. I mean, Lukashenko did away with term limits in 2004. He's been in power for 25 years. I mean, the guy has a monopoly.
But I mean, if they want to get rid of him.
Well, I'm not sure that they do. I think they want this soft integration project to move forward, and so long as Lukashenko is willing to play ball, and he doesn't really have too many other options, then they're going to pursue that, and hence the meeting in Sochi this weekend. So, a military invasion of Belarus is the last thing.
It's the last. That's the highest thing on the escalation
he'll
ladder.
do it if he's afraid that Belarus is going to somehow drift into the Western orbit, but that's not realistic. So, soft integration is on the table. I think Lukashenko, obviously he's going to win re-election, in quotes. It's going to be a selection, not a re-election. And Putin will be happy with that. He doesn't love Lukashenko, but he knows how to work with him.
Now, he's made some interesting remarks lately. He said after the so-called parliamentary elections earlier last month, he's announced he's going to run for president, but said, I'm not going to stick around until my fingers turn blue. I thought it was his normally very, very colorful Russian language. And a lot of people took that as a sign. And I've gotten signals from Minsk, Mike, you may have too, that he is thinking about a transition, that his health is not great right now. There's rumors coming out of Minsk. That
Relatively young, though, but yeah.
He's relatively young, but I've heard, and again, unconfirmed rumors that he's not well and that he's thinking about a transition. I don't know how seriously to take these things. Mike, have you come across anything like that?
Well, all dictators have to think about transition, and sooner rather than later is, the preferred way to do it. And he's clearly grooming his son to try to take his place. And so I think that would be the preferred transfer of power from Lukashenko's perspective. Whether that meets with Moscow's approval or not remains to be seen. He continues to shuffle, as he has for the last 25 years, some of his top cadres in order to ensure that everyone is loyal to him personally and not too loyal to other power centers, including Moscow. So I think that's where that stands right now. I think Lukashenko is looking to pass power to his son at the appropriate moment, but that moment hasn't come yet.
Right. Don, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, a couple of points to build on what you both have said. A lot of us who have watched Belarus for a long time ask ourselves, to what extent is allowing the opposition a voice, or watching demonstrations a repeat of what's happened before, going back to the late 1990s. And it's a challenge, really, to sort out the fakes from the reality.
Yes.
And that's what makes it both interesting and also frustrating. The second point I wanted to make is I find the flirtation with Belarus national symbols are very interesting.
Lukashenko's
flirtation, a very interesting strategy. I think when I was overseeing the Belarus service at RFE, someone told me 10% of the Belarusians speak Belarusian as a native. Very low.
Right.
So this is not Ukraine, and this is not going to be something that goes that direction. I think, as you both said, if Putin wanted him out, he'd be out, but Putin doesn't want him out necessarily, at least in an abrupt manner right now. And so this ruling and bringing in the fish with the fishing pole is a lot easier, I think.
I think there may be a weak sense of nationhood, but there's a very strong sense of statehood, actually, in Belarus, unexpectedly. Despite itself.
I agree with Dawn that we're not in a 1989 scenario, but the sands are shifting within the social foundations of Belarus. There are essentially a sort of a twin process going on. There is a process of national revival that is very clear, that's happening not only within society at large, but it's happening within the nomenklatura, and that's very important. And hence you see the revival of Belarusian symbols, language, culture, a renewed interest in Belarusian history. And so all of that is happening sort of at a society-wide level. And at the same time, you do have a growth in civic consciousness. Yes. Yeah. It is different from the civic movements or the opposition movements that we saw 10 years ago or 15 years ago. It is not as anti-regime focused right now. It is more focused on sort of expanding space within civil society to implement a variety of different goals, from environmental goals to educational goals. There's a whole range of actors who are quite active and vibrant within this space. And it's something to watch. I'm not predicting a solidarity-like movement emerging in Belarus a la 1989 in the next year or two. But clearly things are stirring, and we can't neglect that.
Yeah, that's something I want to get into in a little more depth in the second half, is what the domestic dynamics, because they are, as Mike pointed out, very interesting. Don, you wanted to say something, and then I wanted to move on.
No, I want to get into U.S. policy, but let's hold that, I think, for a while.
Yeah, no, that's where I want to go, because what I'm hearing, and I don't disagree, is that there is kind of an inevitability to this process that we're seeing here.
Toward Moscow.
Russia's soft annexation of Belarus is proceeding apace. Lukashenko is trying to resist it. We can argue about why he's trying to resist it. I think he's basically desperate. But I don't think he has a lot of options. Do we have options? Because do we have to prepare ourselves in the national security community to face the fact that Belarus is going to be a de facto extension of Russia's Western Military District? Because up until now, despite all his faults, and they are legion, Lukashenko has resisted Russian military presence on Belarusian territory, and that matters. That matters a lot, because if you think of the lead time before troops would get to the Polish border or the Lithuanian border or the Latvian border, it would be closed considerably if those troops are already there. Right?
Yes, but has he resisted, or is it really the driving dynamic that Putin hasn't cared enough?
No,
to push
Putin's
it?
cared enough. They've been pushing for this airbase since 2015.
There's pushing and there's pushing. I don't have a good answer for it.
Yeah.
But yes, he's resisted. He's
resisted on the airbase, and there are no full-fledged Russian bases on Belarusian territory. There are military installations, but there aren't any full-fledged bases on Belarusian territory. That would all change if this soft annexation goes through.
Well, maybe yes, maybe no. I think a lot of the chief strategists around Lukashenko have wanted to resist Moscow's an increased Russian military footprint in Belarus, and people like Stanislav Zas or Vladimir Mackay fall into that camp. So it's possible that soft annexation proceeds in the economic sphere and the military integration remains what it is, which is actually very closely and tightly integrated. I mean, Belarus is part of the Russian air defense system.
Right.
They train together, they exercise together. There are so many links within the Belarusian Ministry of Defense to Moscow. I visited the Suvorov Military Academy in Minsk when I was there last year. They're churning out basically Red Army cadets. I mean, the Soviet ideology is alive and well. And of course, loyalty to Moscow. So I think it's possible that we'll see this soft absorption take place even without a Russian airbase. But look, what Lukashenko is trying to do is scare us. He's also trying to scare the West into thinking that, oh my gosh, Belarus is about to slip out and become fully part of the Russian orbit. Well, let's be frank, it already is. But he wants to scare us so that he can get goodies from us, right? And so that's his strategy. I'm not saying that we should be passive in this regard. I think, in fact, as I said, it would be great if we could give Belarus loans that are conditional, if we could encourage Western investment, if we could especially encourage people-to-people ties.
Yeah.
To my mind, that's crucial. But our policy instruments are few and far between in a country that is de facto part of Putin's sphere of interest.
Yeah, no, I mean, the best I could come up with in terms of policy recommendations when I spoke to the Helsinki Commission were three things. And Mike, I think we're basically on the same page. Engage civil society and basically amidst this fierce Russian disinformation campaign in Belarus right now. INSOR just did a report on this, basically arguing that Belarus isn't really a nation at all. So engage civil society and feed into this national awakening. And this would also have the added benefit of making Belarus more indigestible should it come to a military option. But then I would also argue we should be investing in the high-tech sector. They are trying to develop a high-tech sector. This would decrease Belarus's dependence on Moscow. And it would, over the long run, could lead to a more pluralistic environment. It would change the political economy of Belarus and could potentially lead to a more pluralistic political arrangements. And finally, a very clear and unambiguous signal to Moscow that while we do not like Lukashenko, we regard Belarusian sovereignty as sacrosanct, and any effort, kinetic or non-kinetic, to absorb it into Russia would be seen as a hostile act. That's the best I could come up with.
But then
I couldn't come up with anything else.
I think we all agree, but a hostile act, and Putin will go like, "Nu что?"
Yeah. No, I think Don's right, unfortunately. But, if I could, I'd like to come back to the second point you made, which is the first point you made on counter-propaganda, because I think there we have some room to play ball. If you look at Belarus closely, you'll see that it's the same actors involved in spreading propaganda and disinformation as were involved in the Donbass. 4, 5, and even 10 years ago. So Konstantin Malofeyev is a big player in Belarus. Yes. Malofeyev is, of course, the owner of Tsargrad TV.
Right.
He's an oligarch who has funded all kinds of nationalistic and neo-imperialist efforts inside Russia, outside Russia. He's very, very active in Belarus. And there is a network of civil society actors who want to resist this pro-Russian propaganda and sort of vassal state status that is being applied to them. And we should encourage them. And there's a number of ways to do that. Some of it is in the cultural sphere. There's also localization of content. We should be, by the way, providing Belarus with, Hollywood movies that are translated or have subtitles in Belarusian. That's what we should be doing. Things like that. It may seem like minor stuff, but with so few instruments available to us right now, we have to play the long game. And the long game is to support this national revival and civic consciousness at the same time.
Do you think this investing in this high-tech sector is worth it, or is this?
Definitely. Right now, the Belarus sees the answer to its investment problems in China.
Yes.
And, my last trip to Minsk, you see Chinese billboards plastered all over the place. Clearly, Lukashenko thinks, well, okay, if Putin's not going to give me money for my high-tech sector, I'm going to turn to Beijing. And Beijing is willing to play ball. But, the problem with U.S. investments in this sector, and by the way, a lot of Silicon Valley tech firms have outsourced to Belarusian programmers and IT specialists. But the problem is property rights, it's the business climate, and it's the fact that a lot of what Belarusians do right now is sort of low-end stuff, the sort of stuff that you can't really find someone in Silicon Valley to do because it's too low-paying for the Valley. So they outsource it there. There's not really the high-end innovation that's taking place. Although there's a bit here and there.
And they have, I agree the business climate isn't great, but they have tried to turn the tech sector into this island of a rational business climate.
Every Belarusian kid I talk to, not many, but a few, they all want to be programmers.
Right.
They don't want to be doctors or lawyers, right? Or civil servants. They want to be programmers. That's where they see the money.
Don, any thoughts on U.S. policy here?
Well, yeah, I very much agree with however I might describe the kind of the cultural soft power engagement, because a big misstep would provoke Moscow to act more assertively than we want them to act. So we have to ask ourselves, what scenarios are realistic over the short term? How would we define a creeping annexation that we could live with, and maybe keep the Russian military at a relatively low level of presence there, let them deal with each other economically and otherwise? We have to decide, I think, more clearly what we want out of this, putting aside some of the more idealistic conceptions.
Now, I think the whole point of this economic soft integration is to get the military integration.
Yes,
I think that's what Moscow wants.
It may well be,
I think Moscow wants Putin wants two things. He wants the military advantage of actually having Belarus be an actual de jure as well as de facto extension of the Russian Western Military District, bringing Russian power up to the borders of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. I think that, and by the way, creating another vector from which to threaten Ukraine. So I think that's what it's about. The other thing is Putin's 2024 question, basically. I do think, I know our colleague Maria Snegovaya is skeptical of that angle. I think I agree with her that the main motivation here is a geostrategic motivation, but I don't discount the
it's
domestic
a scenario
political,
among several to be.
It's one among several that gives them more options. So I think that's the point of all this. I guess my question is, what kind of time frame are we looking at here? How much time do we have to play with before this becomes a fait accompli? And what can we do within that time window? Any thoughts on that? I mean,
I think the economic integration is going to move forward, and there's nothing really we can do about it. But if we play this right, if we don't do anything rash and stupid, and we support this sort of national revival movement inside Belarus and engage smartly with conditionality, because conditionality is key. We can't just simply engage because we think that otherwise we're going to lose Belarus, because then we're going to lose our money, and Belarus will become part of Russia anyway. But if we engage smartly, I think there's a long game to be played here. Belarus has a very lengthy border with Poland and Lithuania, and Poland and Lithuania are two EU and NATO countries that have really succeeded tremendously in terms of their transformation since 1989. And the more Belarusians travel to those countries and see that transformation, I mean, you look at like Polish GDP, it's doubled since '89. and the standard of living is so much higher than in Belarus. And by the way, on my visits to Warsaw, a lot of the Uber drivers are Belarusians, and they go back. They go back, right? They have family in Belarus, and so the more they see that, the more they will be uncomfortable with this sort of vassal state status that Putin is trying to impose on Belarus.
This may be the way to do it. Let it happen. With this kind of engagement, let it happen. Putin clearly doesn't want the Americans there, but this way it happens more naturally, more organically. And I think that's a better, more stable, more enduring kind of thing we want to see. And it's almost not devoid of U.S. policy, but U.S. policy is then exercised in a different kind of way, less provocatively.
So let Moscow overreach, given the domestic problems the regime in Moscow has right now. Perhaps this could be their undoing. Because I mean, if you're talking about this economic integration, you're basically talking about Russia buying the Belarusian economy at a time when the Russian economy is stagnating.
They pretty much own it. Gazprom owns the gas sector.
But subsidizing it, they'll have to, like with Crimea, they're going to have to subsidize it.
Yep.
And the Belarusians are accustomed to a certain kind of Soviet-level standard of living that they're not going to give up so easily. So they're going to have to continue subsidizing it, probably at a higher level than they're subsidizing it now. The last thing before we moved into the second section I wanted to do is, and Mike, you raised China, because China is very engaged in Belarus. And it's not really always playing Moscow's game. I mean, Lukashenko has been sourcing arms from China as much, and you're getting increased talk from the technocratic wing of the elite. We all tend to talk to the same folks over there. And these people are saying, well, that China's not so bad. It'd be good if kind of the West and China cooperated together in Belarus. This is the wing of the elite that doesn't want Moscow to dominate. How should the West play the China? Can the West play a China card in Belarus?
I don't think there's really any card to play. The Chinese see Belarus as an investment destination. They both procure weapons from Belarus, also sell some weapons. So they have this economic relationship, but the Chinese understand that this is Putin's backyard, and they're not going to upset Putin. And so just as they are cautious in Central Asia with what they do militarily, they're very cautious, even more cautious in Belarus. So I don't think Xi Jinping is going to overreach. I think the Belarusians Lukashenko will be happy to accept Chinese economic investment, and that's pretty much where it ends. And as far as what we can do, look, unfortunately, Chinese investments are done in a completely different way. They're not market-based. They're based on, money under the table and connections, usually corrupt connections that grease the way for these investments to take place. And so there's just simply not a lot we can do other than insist that if they want our money, if they want our investments, if they want our trade, then they got to play according to our rules.
Right. Okay, Don, you agree? You don't really see a China. You don't really see a China card to play, because it is something that the technocratic wing of the Belarusian elite is selling us. I tend to think we're getting sold a bill of goods here. That there is an opportunity here that China's not so bad, and the West should play ball with China to help us fight the Russians. I don't buy it. It sounds like you guys.
I think there's the black hole is those parts of the elite we don't talk to, and how penetrated or pro-Russian they are, and they're not going to allow that to happen beyond much of what it is already.
All right, well, on that note, we'll shift gears. In a few moments, we'll continue our discussion and take a little bit of a closer look at the internal political dynamics in Belarus, which we touched upon a bit in the first half. I'd like to remind you are listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Michael Carpenter, director of the Penn Biden Center. Also with us in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the vertical video at sipa.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Following parliamentary elections last month, Alyaksandr Lukashenko announced that he would seek another term as president, surprise, surprise, in elections next August. He also added, however, that I won't hang on to my seat with my fingers turning blue. In the recent past, Lukashenko has talked about a constitutional reform, raising speculation that he was considering succession at some point. Mike, we discussed this a little bit in the first half, but I see a lot of, in addition to Lukashenko's comments about not staking around till his fingers turning blue, which is an image I'd rather not have in my head on a Friday afternoon. We've seen some other dynamics going on domestically, mostly with cadre politics, with personnel moves. I mean, you had Shunevich step down.
Yeah.
Interesting move.
Yeah.
You have
the Minister of Interior.
The Minister of Interior
right.
stepping down. He was the key pro-Moscow element in the elite. He led the pro-Moscow wing.
Yeah, although when he came in, he was seen as being Lukashenko's handpicked choice to ensure that there was some sort of oversight over the Interior Ministry. So, but you're right.
Stanislav Zash is going to CSTO.
Yeah, now that's interesting.
And that's very interesting.
Yeah.
So
I think Moscow wanted to draw him out of Minsk because they saw him as part of this cadre within the nomenclatura that was more sovereignty-oriented and less Russia-oriented, if you will, to put it in very simplistic terms.
Right.
And so I think they offered him this very nice position as head of the CSTO, which made the Armenians extremely nervous. And by the way, the reason it made the Armenians nervous is because Lukashenko has said pretty clearly, look, if there's a CSTO conflict, for example, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, I don't want to be involved in it. That's for the Armenians to defend themselves, or the Russians, but not us.
But they were also up to have the chairmanship as well, and I think
that's right.
There was that.
So I see a lot of these shuffles right now as designed, as all of the previous cadre shuffles in Belarus have been, to augment Lukashenko's personal power and ensure that he has loyalists in the key positions.
Loyalists vis-a-vis whom?
Loyalists vis-a-vis him and his family. Now, he has to allow for a certain degree of Russian influence to make the Kremlin happy. And so, for example, he's got Ravkov as his defense minister. Ravkov is a thoroughly Russian-educated, Russian-trained officer who is loyal to the Kremlin. So he's willing to have people like that in very high
BKGB.
Very high important positions. But then in terms of BKGB and especially internal control over the population within the country, he wants to have his guys there.
Don, what do you see?
I would disagree. I think, we have to always keep in mind that he's got two challenges, one from below and one from the east. And so he makes moves responding to both. And in that the Babic thing is very interesting as well.
Well, yeah, the whole Babic thing was interesting.
Yeah, and it's easier, I think, to overestimate his autonomy than it really exists. It's a mixed picture.
Except that they did get Babic fired. I mean,
he did. He has his victories.
As Russia's ambassador
he resisted
to Belarus.
Babic. For whatever reason, the Kremlin said okay.
There was a security official arrested ostensibly for bribery right around the time Babic was
But it would get back to the same problem of analyzing Belarus politics. How do these mix of factors, what is the balance? And that shifts all the time. The Babic case was something that people point to as indicating he has some clout with Putin.
Well, the interesting thing is the Babic case, Mikhail Babic, the Russian ambassador in Minsk, actually, in a sense, played to our interests in the West because he saw himself as the proconsul of Belarus and was so damn arrogant and overplayed his hand to such a degree that I think a lot of ordinary Belarusians looked at this guy and said, who the hell are you? You're just an ambassador. Who are you telling us what to do?
Right. No, and Babic had played this role before inside the Russian Federation.
Yes, he did.
He played this role in Chechnya. He played this role in Tatarstan. He played this role in Bashkortostan. And he was just looking at Belarus as just another one of these assignments where he has to quell a restive Russian region. And he did overplay his hand. But when he was appointed, and we talked about this on this program, and I did vertical videos along these lines, that this was a clear signal to me that Russia was going to take the gloves off with Belarus by sending this guy at this time. And then when he was recalled, I was like, That's interesting. Tactical retreat. What's Moscow's thinking here? Why do they think they overplayed their hand? Or did it suggest that Lukashenko had a little bit more autonomy than we thought he had? I didn't know how to read that. How do you guys read that?
Well, the way I read Babich's appointment in the first place is a little bit at variance with what you said earlier, which is that Russia's overriding goal is military presence in Belarus and making the country part of the Western Military District. I think there is an ideological component to Putin and to his clearly Patrushev and a number of his other trusted advisors. They subscribe to this vision of the Russian Empire, and Putin does sort of see himself as the gatherer of lands. And so there is this, they just can't help themselves. They have this imperialistic mindset, and Babich is clearly a part of that group. And so hence his appointment to Minsk, he overplayed his hand. Now they've got someone who's a little bit quieter, more deft, and attuned to local sensitivities.
Yeah, they don't see Russia. They don't see Belarus as a fully independent sovereign state.
They don't.
And we've seen this problem that Mike well describes across the horizon as they look out, and it causes all sorts of problems. But again, I think the informality of the relationship, and it's becoming closer, shows that they don't necessarily have to go for the de jure, which is alienating the West, might prolong sanctions, and they can do a lot of this on their own. If Babich is breaking too many eggs, you put in somebody else. I think that's the way they're going, independent of the succession issue.
Going back to, I wanted to make one more point on the cadre shuffles. Because I was almost kind of keeping a scorecard of pro-Russia or pro-independence people up and down and who is moving. Shunevich out, that's one down for the Russia team, right? You had Matuszewski, the deputy prime minister who was pushing for economic reform, was seen largely as kind of a quiet member of the pro-independence wing. He's out. But you also see McKay seeming to rise in stature in the Lukashenko regime, which is not a win for Moscow. Moscow wants him out. And then you have Zash going to CSTO, which is again a loss for the independence team. How is this the right way to look at it? Should we be kind of almost looking at these cadre shuffles in this way? I've long said we have to up our Kremlinology game on Belarus to get a better sense of this. Is this the right way to look at it, Mike? Am I barking up the wrong tree?
I think in
here?
general terms, yes. I think there's a very careful balancing act that Lukashenko feels like he has to placate certain Russian interests, but his overriding concern is his own personal power and that of his family. And so that's his number one goal, is ensuring that the key Siloviki, the key security institutions, are manned by people who are loyal to him personally. And then in certain other, because he has to balance, there are certain other positions that are given to folks that have closer ties to Moscow that maybe are loyal to him, but where he's willing to accept a little bit more distance.
But
Kremlinology is the right Minskology.
Minsk, yeah. I don't. Yeah, we have to come up with a better term.
By the way, with Shunevich's dismissal, it was interesting to read how he spoke out about his own dismissal. He was so sycophantic and so self-deprecatory in his remarks. Clearly, he completely subservient to Lukashenko, despite everything you just said about him being Moscow's guy.
Yeah, and there are, he is rumored to be in Russia, which would not be surprise anybody, and he's also rumored to be sick. Now, again, this is Belarus, and you don't know how much stock to put in these rumors. But I wanted to pick up, Mike, on what you were saying about this balancing act. As this integration continues, the scales are going to be tipped there. And Lukashenko is going to inevitably, if this integration goes through, be forced to lean toward what Moscow wants rather than what he wants, and that will have implications across the board, I think. No,
I think so. I think that's right. I think Moscow is getting its way, and Lukashenko can do very little to stop that from happening.
Although I'm not ruling, I'm curious to see what is said after this meeting this weekend. They're meeting over the course of this weekend in Sochi. And Lukashenko's comments in advance of the meeting were to the effect that I'm not going to sign anything that sacrifices Belarus's sovereignty. Now, before
But he would say that, yes.
But before that, you had the Belarusian ambassador to Russia saying, well, they've already basically agreed to a common government and a common parliament, and which got everybody's attention earlier this week. Now, later it came out that he misspoke. So there's all these mixed signals coming out. And again, I don't think we're going to get a clear signal after this weekend.
Follow the money.
One way or the other. Follow the money.
Well, one thing, if I had to predict what's going to happen in Sochi, I would predict that the Belarusian side, Lukashenko, will play rope-a-dope. Will say we are very close, but there are still some issues that this is going to drag on for some time.
Yeah, but Russia's getting sick of this game, and it's well known that Putin and Lukashenko despise each other personally. They really do not like each other. And so I'm wondering when Russia's going to lose its patience and perhaps may do something rash at some point. And that's where I wanted to go now, is this 2020 election. Because I actually think that this is going to be the most unpredictable Belarusian election that we've seen. That's a low bar. I understand it's a very, very low bar, right? But I'm wondering that this is an opportunity if Russia would like to replace Lukashenko with a completely loyal KGB general who is basically going to do everything Moscow wants, and that's effectively what they want there. That's the time to do it. That's going to be the time to do it. And you have to wonder if Moscow's going to make a move. Now, looking at the signals, looking at the parliamentary election that just happened last month, everybody was expecting the one or two token opposition figures to get in there for Lukashenko to throw some bone to the West. It didn't happen. Not a single opposition figure got in there, which made me think he is getting nervous about this and he going into 2020. Or am I reading this entirely wrong? Are we going to have a completely predictable 2020 election?
Probably.
I don't think it's unpredictable in terms of the result, like who's going to win, who's going to win Ohio. It's nothing like that. But for Russian activity in this election, I don't rule out the fake Maidan scenario. I don't rule out.
I am very skeptical about something like that. I think I think at the end of the day, Putin is relatively comfortable with Lukashenko, and he's going to win re-election almost certainly. But the Kremlin is nervous about who's going to succeed Lukashenko. That's their number one concern. And they would love to have someone like a Ramzan Kadyrov who can really crack down and keep an iron fist. And Lukashenko has pretty much done that, by the way. But they're worried that maybe his successor won't have the same popular legitimacy and grip on power to be able to pull it off. And so I think that's where their concern is most acute. I think they're fine with Lukashenko winning re-election.
I think they would rather have something a little bit more loyal.
They'd rather, yes, but they can live with the current situation, I think. And you pull out the molar, there's a lot of other little stuff that comes with it.
Well, that's what I always think had been stopping them. I always thought Putin was not terribly comfortable with Lukashenko. He's acceptable. He's the minimum that's acceptable. But they'd much rather have somebody less erratic, somebody that keeps his mouth shut, somebody that does as they're told. And he doesn't always do as he's told. He's been resisting on this base.
But at a time when they want to loosen sanctions, when they feel that they're doing pretty well with relations and foreign policy with the West and the U.S., why be provocative? Why not let the situation continue?
Well, I don't think they have to be provocative. They can basically do a spetsoperacja and get what they want there. I've been expecting something like this for a while, just knowing the dynamic between those two. And
but one of those special operations has so much risk of going sideways that I agree with Don. I think right now Putin is happy just sort of keeping things steady. Of course, soft integration is priority number one, but he's not going to rock the boat. Not right now.
All right. Well, on that note, I guess Don, last thoughts?
Completely off the subject, guys. Since you and I, Brian, and I know Michael, have a lot of Lithuanian friends, so I wanted to mention the reactor because they will be listening to the program. and say we understand their
Ostrovets. You wanted to bring in Ostrovets into our discussion.
We just don't have enough time to talk about it in the fullness that it deserves.
Well, no, I think the Ostrovets reactor actually is the subject of a whole program.
Yes, we're finishing up a paper on that,
and I mean, I see it as a.
But they will write us both and say, "Why didn't you guys talk about the reactor?"
No, it's a huge hybrid threat.
It is a huge issue.
It's a huge hybrid threat.
Important.
It's a I call it a nuclear Nord Stream 2.
Yeah, I lay a
because
marker
this is
here,
another
Brian,
part of
so
Russia.
to save our reputations here in the office.
Oh, thank you, Don. And no, I fully intend at some point to do an entire program on the Ostrovets reactor. I think it's an understudied element of Russian hybrid activity, and the whole nuclear.
Yeah. Exactly.
Card they're playing, which is also part of their entire, using energy as a weapon and using energy as a geopolitical tool. So I think, but we will, This is not a subject
we'll come back to it.
We've noted it,
Yeah,
and we're going to
exactly.
come back to it. So, okay, thank you, Don. You've saved my
saved
reputation with our Lithuanian friends. So, and on that note, we'll wrap it up. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you have been listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio has been former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Michael Carpenter, current director of the Penn Biden Center. Also with us in the studio has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you, gentlemen, for an enlightening discussion.
Thank you.
And
Thanks, Brian.
Also like to thank our producer, Michal Harmata, for keeping the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled and in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SIPA.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Join us again next week, and now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.